While I was in seminary, one of my internships was with the Kentucky Council of Churches. At the time, I thought that my call to ministry centered around working for a faith-based advocacy agency of some sort. As you may know, both of my parents were parish ministers, and so I was clinging to the idea that I would do something different in ministry. God can have a fun sense of humor, but that is a topic for another day. As an intern with the Kentucky Council of Churches, one of my opportunities or responsibilities was to attend the annual assembly, when representatives from churches from across the state would gather to do the business of the council. Think of it as a convention with a lot of praying and preaching. This particular assembly was held at the Third Baptist Church in Owensboro, Kentucky. They had a great mission statement on the wall of their hall, which has always stuck with me. It said, "Christ first, others second, we're third." The assembly was a two-day event, as you might expect with a faith-based gathering like this. At the end of the first day of business, we gathered to worship in the beautiful sanctuary at Third Baptist. Now, for a little context, it had been a stormy day, and on several occasions, the tornado warning siren had gone off, so often, in fact, that we had begun to ignore it. That ignorance lifted when, during the closing worship service, the siren sounded and the executive director's assistant came in and whispered in her ear. Apparently, a tornado had touched down about a mile away from the church. So we very quickly made our way to the basement of the church to wait for an all clear. Now, they say that a tornado sounds like a train approaching and then coming through. And it turns out that they are right. About 10 minutes after we got into the basement, we heard that sound, and there was substantial rumbling as the tornado not only passed by, but tore through the sanctuary in which we had been worshiping just about 10 minutes earlier. As we sat or stood together in that basement, one among us began to have a panic attack, prompted either by the impending tornado or a touch of claustrophobia. Whatever the reason, the person began to get very agitated, and despite the efforts of those around her, that agitation did not subside. That is until my friend Kent, who was the minister of the church I later served as a student intern, began leading the gathered community in some familiar hymns. At that point, the anxiety in the basement seemed to wash away, for I believe we were all reminded in that moment that we were in fact people of faith, and there was comfort to be found in the promises of that faith. Now, whether you read the passage we heard this morning as proscriptive from the mouth of Jesus as he predicts the troubles that are to come, or if you read it as descriptive, as the writings of the gospel writer, as he offers a theological context for what has occurred, contained within this text is a strong sense of hope for what is to come on the other side of troubles. It's all there in the punchline, for at the end they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with great power and glory. This is, as you may already understand, a prediction filled with apocalyptic overtones of the second coming. Should you want more detail and a slightly more graphic perspective, I might invite you to take a walk through the book of Revelation. For many Christians, this is too sensational an idea, too grim a prediction, not to mention too exclusive. Yet regardless of where you stand on its interpretation, what we find underlying the passage is a powerful word of hope. And more than that, I believe is it a call to us as people of faith to look to and embrace our faith, to reach out to Christ not only when it's easy, when we can simply celebrate our abundant blessings, but to do so when our faith may be challenged, when the circumstances of life might cause us to question, to doubt, or even give up. I recently saw a graphic online built on the famous message of the poem Footprints in the Sand. It showed a progression from 2 sets of footprints to one single set, and then that same single set with what looked like a trough in the sand next to it. And I believe the caption read, "And that is when I was dragging you." One quick aside, one of the most wonderful things about our scriptures is how wonderfully consistent human nature is across location and time. In our time, we know by our own experience and by the experiences of people we know that it can be easy to lose faith, especially when things in our life are hard. And both Jesus, who is quoted in our passage, and the gospel writer knew that well in their time. And speaking to the powerful promises of better days to come can be an important way to reassure a people or even a person who is facing a crisis of faith in the midst of hard times. I would invite you to think for just a moment about whether you have ever faced such a moment. After the loss of a job, or the loss of a loved one, or when the things you wanted seemed always just out of reach. Life can seem unfair or simply too much, and we can just come to a point where we don't understand why a God who is purported to love us so much could allow such things to happen. I get it, because I have felt that way. After my mother passed at a far too early age of 54 from a recurrence of breast cancer, I, the son of 2 ministers who had literally grown up in the church, simply stopped. I stopped attending. I stopped believing. I stopped caring about my faith. Honestly, it was just too hard for me to reconcile how this person who had dedicated her life to the church, to the service of God in the world, could be taken away. Perhaps the wording betrays how I really felt. Motivated by my own wants and needs, I did not understand how she could be taken away from me. And I wanted nothing to do with a God who would do such a terrible thing. Grief and anger can really narrow our focus, can't they? It took a lot of time and more than a lot of conversations with my father before I got past the anger and the grief, before I rediscovered my faith, but this time from a very different way. For looking back, what I learned was that I had allowed the anger and the grief to take over, and that narrowing effect worked in direct opposition to what my faith sought. While the painful emotions served to narrow my view, faith is intended to expand our worldview, so we might see more of what is out there, more of what is possible, so we might see the power behind the promises of God. For no matter how long the tunnel of our grief might be, God is waiting on the other side to love us, perhaps even to pull us through or drag us. Looking back on my own experiences, I've come to view my Christian faith in what I hope is a fuller way. The anger and the grief are real emotions, and given the loss, they were most certainly justified. I see, though, that God is not intimidated by our anger. And God is persistent, seeking ways to invite us back into relationship, even when we have chosen to disconnect. For God is there to help us through the difficult times, and that, my friends, is perhaps the most powerful promise of our faith. Last Saturday night, during the wonderful sanctuary celebration, the performers offered a rendition of one of my favorite songs from recent Broadway musicals, the song "You Will Be Found" from Dear Evan Hansen. In fact, when introducing the song, Steve Campbell noted my love for this particular piece. Now, the reason I love it is that I believe it gives voice to the promise in a beautiful way, that same promise found in today's passage, a promise to us as individuals and as a collected people of God, facing the pain of isolation. Evan sings, "Even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need a friend to carry you, and when you're broken on the ground, you will be found. So let the sun come streaming in, for you'll reach up and you'll rise again. Lift your head and look around. You will be found." Amen.